The frost on the saloon window had fractured the world into 1,000 shards of lantern light and drunken laughter. Arthur Blackwood didn't need the distortion, his world had been broken for a year. He stared at the cards in his hand, a full house, aces over kings. A winning hand. A meaningless victory. The pot was a paltry collection of coins and promissory notes, but the real stake, the one thrown in as a cruel, final jest by a man named Finch, sat in the corner of the room. Two girls, no older than 16, with identical faces carved from pale jade and eyes as dark and still as a frozen lake. They were Chinese, sold off a ship, and Finch had won them in a game last week, boasting of their silence and obedience. He'd put their indenture papers in the pot to mock Arthur, the grieving widower who had locked himself away on his desolate ranch. What's a man with a ghost for a wife and a shadow for a daughter need with more silence? Finch had sneered. Arthur had called his bet, not out of desire, but out of a cold, bottomless fury. Now, the pot was his. The saloon fell into a thick, syrupy quiet as Finch shoved the papers across the table. They're yours, Blackwood. Enjoy the quiet. The men laughed, a hollow, rattling sound. Arthur folded the papers, tucked them into his coat, and rose from the table without a word. He didn't look at the girls, not yet. He could feel their presence like a brand on his back as he walked out into the biting wind. They followed him, their soft-soled shoes making no sound on the hard-packed dirt. The journey back to the ranch was a long, cold pilgrimage through a landscape of skeletons. The cottonwoods were bare, their branches clawing at a gunmetal sky. The wind howled a lonely dirge across the plains. Arthur rode his horse, the girls walking behind the wagon he'd brought to town for supplies. He hadn't offered them a ride. The transaction had been ugly and inhuman, and a part of him wanted to maintain that distance, to treat them as the cargo they were supposed to be. But every time he glanced back, he saw two figures, ramrod straight, moving with a synchronized, unnerving grace, their dark coats blending into the twilight. They did not speak. They did not stumble. They simply endured, their faces impassive masks against the cold and the indignity. When they finally reached the ranch, the house stood as a dark silhouette against the bruised purple of the horizon. It was a tomb, a monument to all he had lost. Smoke did not curl from its chimney. Light did not bloom in its windows. It was as cold and empty as his heart. He slid from his horse, the leather creaking in the stillness, and finally turned to face them. In the faint moonlight, he could see their faces were dusted with frost, their lips tinged with blue. He saw not property, but two terrified children trying desperately to appear strong. A flicker of something, shame, perhaps, stirred in the ashes of his soul. He gestured numbly toward the door. "In," he said, his voice a rusty croak. They slipped past him into the darkness, two shadows merging with the greater shadow of his home. The inside of the house was a shrine to stale grief. A fine layer of dust coated every surface, muting the memory of his wife's touch. The air was heavy with the scent of cold ash and disuse. A child's doll lay on the floor by the hearth, its button eyes staring into the gloom. This was the world he had built since Sarah's death, a fortress of sorrow, and he had just invited two strangers into its heart. The girls stood just inside the door, their hands tucked into their sleeves, their gaze sweeping the room with an unnerving thoroughness. They took in the unwashed dishes, the cold fireplace, the single chair he sat in night after night, nursing a bottle and his own misery. He expected fear, or perhaps contempt. He saw only a quiet assessment, a silent cataloguing of broken things. He lit a lantern, the sudden flare of light making them flinch. The flame cast long, dancing shadows, making the room seem even more haunted. He pointed to a small, dark room off the kitchen, barely more than a storage closet with a narrow cot. There, he grunted, the single word a dismissal. He turned his back on them, intending to retreat into his own room, into the familiar solitude of his despair. But he stopped. A sound, faint and rhythmic, reached him. It was the sound of sweeping. He turned back. One of the girls had found a broom in the corner and was methodically clearing a path through the dust, her movements economical and precise. The other had gone to the kitchen pump, and soon the clank of the handle echoed in the oppressive silence. They hadn't waited for an order. They had seen the disarray and, without a word, had begun to mend it. He watched them for a long time, a statue in the flickering lantern light. They moved around each other in a silent ballet of purpose, one gathering kindling while the other scrubbed the grime from the stovetop. They found a half-empty sack of flour and some withered potatoes in the pantry and began to prepare a meal. The scent of cooking, a smell absent from this house for a year, began to fill the cold air. It was a ghost of a scent, a memory of a life that was no longer his. He felt an unwelcome warmth spread through his chest, a thawing in a place he thought had frozen solid. He retreated to his chair by the hearth, watching them, feeling like an intruder in his own home. They were a quiet, relentless force, pushing back the tide of his neglect, and he did not know whether to be grateful or resentful. His daughter, Lily, was a whisper. A 6-year-old wisp of a girl with her mother's wide, solemn eyes and a silence that had fallen like a shroud the day they buried Sarah. She moved through the house like a phantom, her feet bare and soundless on the wooden floors. She ate little, played with nothing, and had not spoken a single word in 367 days. She was the living embodiment of his failure, a constant, quiet accusation. When the twins, Leanne and Mai, began their silent work, Lily watched them from the shadows. She would stand in the doorway of the kitchen, a small, still figure, her thumb tucked in her mouth, her gaze fixed on their fluid movements. They never startled her. They seemed to possess an awareness of her presence, acknowledging her with a slight dip of the head or a soft, fleeting glance before returning to their tasks. They never tried to speak to her, never pushed for a reaction. They simply included her in their sphere of quiet diligence, leaving a small bowl of warm rice porridge on the table for her or folding her worn nightgown and placing it at the foot of her bed. The first bridge was built over a small, carved bird. It was the last thing Arthur had made for his wife, a clumsy attempt at a meadowlark, Sarah's favorite. Lily carried it everywhere, a wooden talisman clutched in her small hand. One afternoon, as she watched Mai mend one of Arthur's shirts with impossibly small, neat stitches, she dropped the bird. It skittered across the floor and came to rest near Mai's feet. Lily froze, her eyes wide with panic. Arthur, watching from his chair, felt his usual surge of helpless inertia. But Mai didn't speak. She simply set aside her sewing, picked up the bird, and held it in her palm for a moment, her fingers gently tracing the rough-hewn wings. Then, she looked at Lily and offered it back, not with a pitying smile, but with a look of shared understanding, as if acknowledging the totem's profound importance. Lily hesitated for a heartbeat, then scurried forward, snatched the bird, and retreated back to her doorway. But for the rest of the day, she stood a little closer, her fear replaced by a fragile curiosity. The true shift came a week later. The house was warmer now, cleaner. The scent of ginger and simmering broth had replaced the smell of dust and decay. Leanne was kneading dough on the floured kitchen table, her movement strong and rhythmic. Lily, emboldened, had crept close enough to touch the edge of the wooden table. She watched, mesmerized by the process. In the corner of the room, on the mantelpiece, was a small, silver-framed photograph of Sarah, smiling, her face full of a light that had long since been extinguished. It was the only photograph Arthur hadn't been able to put away. Lily looked from the photograph to Leanne, then back again. Her brow furrowed in concentration. Her mouth opened, a small, perfect hello. A sound emerged from Lily's throat, a tiny, rusty squeak of effort. Arthur's head snapped up from the ledger he was pretending to read. He held his breath, his heart suddenly a frantic drum against his ribs. Lily pointed a trembling finger toward the photograph on the mantel. Her face was a mask of desperate concentration. She was trying to conjure a name, a memory, from the depths of her self-imposed silence. The twins stopped their work, their stillness absolute. They turned their identical faces toward the little girl, their dark eyes soft with a profound, patient sorrow. Marred Lily whispered, the sound barely audible, fragile as a spider's thread. The effort seemed to exhaust her, and her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. It was then that Leanne, the one kneading the dough, wiped her hands on her apron, walked over to Lily, and knelt down so they were eye to eye. She didn't touch the child. She simply followed her gaze to the photograph. A flicker of recognition, or perhaps something deeper, crossed her features. She looked back at Lily, then at the silver frame. Her lips parted, and she spoke for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Her voice was clear and soft, devoid of any accent, a perfect, startling note in the silent house. "Mama," she said, the word a simple confirmation, a gentle affirmation of Lily's struggle. Then Mai, who stood by the hearth, added her own voice, a mirror image of her sister's. She looked not at the photograph, but at Arthur, her gaze piercing the thick armor he wore around his heart. "Sad," she whispered. The word hung in the air between them, a declaration, not a question. It wasn't just a word, it was a diagnosis. It named the suffocating grief that had poisoned the air in the house for a year. It acknowledged his pain, Lily's pain, the entire hollow-out existence he had curated. Arthur went pale. His blood ran cold, and the ledger slipped from his numb fingers, falling to the floor with a soft thud. It wasn't just that they had spoken in perfect English. It was the devastating accuracy of their perception. In 2 words, these silent strangers had understood more of his family's heart than anyone in the nearby town ever had. They had seen past his gruff exterior, past Lily's muteness, and had named the monster that lived with them. He felt stripped bare, exposed in a way that was both terrifying and, to his shock, faintly liberating. Who were these girls, who could see so clearly into the soul of his home? The cruel joke Finch had played on him suddenly felt like an act of providence, a terrifying, beautiful miracle that had just spoken its first words and irrevocably altered the landscape of his sorrow. The world outside turned white. The blizzard came without warning, a furious, shrieking ghost that clawed at the walls of the house and buried the world in a shroud of snow. For 3 days, they were prisoners, the 4 of them sealed in the small, warm bubble the twins had created within Arthur's frozen fortress. The storm was a crucible, melting away the last of their carefully constructed distances. Arthur, driven by the relentless habit of a rancher, had gone out to check on the livestock just as the first flakes began to fall in earnest. The wind had turned on him with a predator's viciousness, stealing his breath and blinding him with a swirling vortex of ice. By the time he stumbled back into the house, his coat was a sheet of ice and a deep, rattling cough had taken root in his chest. He collapsed before the hearth, shivering violently, the world dissolving into a feverish haze. Through the fog of his illness, he was aware of small, cool hands on his forehead, of a spoon pressing warm, bitter liquid to his lips. He heard soft, murmuring voices, not in English, but in a language that flowed like water, a soothing, melodic current in his delirium. He saw faces, sometimes 1, sometimes 2, swimming in and out of focus, their dark eyes filled with a calm, focused concern. In his fevered dreams, they became Sarah. He would reach out, his hand trembling, and whisper her name. The hands would gently take his, hold it for a moment, and then place it back on his chest. They did not correct him. They simply absorbed his delirious grief, tending to the wounds of both his body and his spirit. Leanne and Mai moved with the seamless efficiency of a seasoned field hospital. One would tend to Arthur, bathing his face and forcing broth down his throat, while the other cared for Lily, ensuring she was warm and fed, distracting her from her father's frightening illness with quiet games of cat's cradle. They found Sarah's old stores of dried herbs in the pantry, yarrow for the fever, mullein for the cough, and brewed potent teas that filled the cabin with their sharp, medicinal scent. They knew, somehow, what each herb was for, their knowledge ancient and instinctual. As the fever raged, pieces of Arthur's past broke free. He spoke of Sarah, of the day they met, of the plans they had made for the ranch, for Lily. He spoke of the guilt that consumed him, the feeling that he had somehow failed her, that he hadn't been strong enough to keep her from the sickness that took her. The twins listened, their faces impassive but their eyes holding a deep, resonant empathy. They did not offer empty platitudes. They simply listened, their silent presence a form of absolution, allowing him to purge the poison of his unspoken sorrow into the safe vessel of their quiet compassion. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Arthur woke to the pale, watery light of a world silenced by snow. The wind had died, and an almost holy quiet had settled over the land. He felt weak, scoured out, but the fire in his lungs had cooled to embers. He was propped up on pillows in his own bed, something he hadn't been in days. The room was clean, and a small vase on his nightstand held a single, brittle sprig of winter sage. He could hear the soft murmur of voices from the main room. He slowly, painfully, sat up. Leaning against the doorframe, he watched the scene before him. Lily was sitting on the floor, a small piece of charcoal in her hand, drawing on a piece of scrap wood. Beside her sat Mai, who was showing her how to form the character for Flower. Lily, in her careful, childish script, was mimicking the strokes. Leanne was at the window, gazing out at the endless white, a thoughtful, distant look on her face. They were not servants. They were not prisoners. They had, in the crucible of the storm, become the heart of the home, pumping life and warmth back into its dormant veins. The sight filled him with a profound and aching sense of gratitude that was so powerful it felt like pain. He had won them as a joke, a piece of property to be forgotten in a corner. But they had saved him. They had cared for his child. They had faced the storm, both outside and inside his house, with a grace and strength he hadn't seen since Sarah. He owed them a debt he could never repay. He owed them their freedom. He cleared his throat, and the three of them looked up. 3 pairs of dark, intelligent eyes fixed on him. "Thank you," he rasped, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. Leanne simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acceptance. Mai gave him a tiny, hesitant smile. But it was Lily who spoke. She held up her piece of wood, pointing to the character she had drawn. "Flower," she said, her voice still soft, but clear and proud. It was the first word she had spoken that wasn't a name, the first word that wasn't born of grief. It was a word of creation, of beauty. Arthur felt the final wall around his heart crumble into dust. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, quiet world, and the possibility of a new spring. The thaw came slowly, first in drips from the eaves, then in gushing rivulets that carved paths through the snow. The world re-emerged, raw and muddy, and with it came the return of men. Arthur saw them from the window, 3 riders cresting the hill, their silhouettes dark against the weak afternoon sun. He recognized the slump-shouldered figure of Finch in the lead. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in his gut. He had known this day would come. He reached for the rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace, the weight of the steel a grim comfort in his hands. Leanne and Mai had seen them too. They herded Lily into the small back room, their movement swift and silent, a primal instinct to protect the young. They didn't look scared, they looked resigned, as if this was a scene they had played out many times before. When Arthur stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side, the 3 men had reined in their horses by the fence. Finch spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "Well, look at that," he sneered, his eyes taking in the wisp of smoke from the chimney, the clean porch. "Looks like you put your winnings to good use, Blackwood." His companions chuckled, their laughter thin and mean in the cold air. "Heard you were sick," Finch continued, his gaze hardening. "Figured you might not have a use for them anymore. We've come to take them off your hands. My friend here is willing to pay double what I lost." Arthur's knuckles were white on the stock of the rifle. He thought of the past week, of the cool hands on his brow, of the quiet strength that had pulled him back from the edge. He thought of Lily's voice, hesitantly naming a flower. These men saw property, a commodity to be traded and used. He saw the women who had resurrected his home, who had given his daughter back her voice. "They're not for sale," Arthur said, his voice low and steady, carrying a weight it hadn't held in a year. Finch's smile vanished. "They ain't yours to sell or not sell. They're indenture, Blackwood. Paper." Just like a deed to a plot of land, he reached into his coat, presumably to produce the documents. It was in that moment that Arthur Blackwood made a choice. It wasn't a choice born of anger or pride, but of a fierce, protective clarity. He was no longer the hollow man from the saloon. He raised the rifle, not aiming it, but holding it as a definitive, uncrossable line. "Their names are Leanne and Mai," he said, the words clear and deliberate. The act of naming them, of speaking their identities into the cold air, felt like a sacred vow. It separated them from the anonymity of property and gave them the dignity these men sought to deny. "They are under my protection. They are family. The word hung in the air, as shocking and transformative as the first words the twins had spoken in his kitchen. Family. It was a word he thought had died with Sarah. Finch stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He saw the change in Arthur's eyes, the unyielding resolve where there had once been only drunken despair. This was not the broken man he had mocked in the saloon. This was a man defending his home, his kin. The other two men shifted uneasily in their saddles, their bravado evaporating in the face of Arthur's cold certainty. "You're crazy, Blackwood," Finch finally spat, though the insult lacked its earlier venom. They're not your kind, they are my kind," Arthur replied, his voice unwavering. "They are the kind that show compassion. The kind that heal. The kind that stand by you in a storm. Now, get off my land." He took a step forward, and the simple movement was more threatening than any shout. It was the movement of a man rooted to his ground, to his convictions. For a long moment, the world held its breath. The only sound was the dripping of melting snow and the nervous stamping of a horse. Then, with a curse, Finch yanked on his reins, turning his horse so sharply it skittered sideways. "This ain't over," he snarled over his shoulder. But it was. They both knew it. As the three riders retreated, their backs slumped in defeat, Arthur remained on the porch, the rifle still in his hands. He stood there until they were nothing but small specks on the horizon. The door creaked open behind him. Leanne and Mai stepped out, their faces unreadable but their eyes shining with a light he had never seen before. Behind them, Lily peeked out, her small hand clutching Mai's sleeve. They had heard everything. They had heard him claim them. He lowered the rifle and turned to face them, his new family. He didn't know what the future held, what new challenges they would face. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt not the crushing weight of the past, but the fragile, hopeful promise of a future. Peace settled over the ranch, not like a blanket, but like the first blades of grass pushing through the thawing mud, tenacious, quiet, and green. The rhythm of their days found a new, gentle cadence. It was a life built of small, significant moments. It was the sight of Lily, her silence now a memory, running through the new grass, her laughter chasing the butterflies, a sound Arthur thought he would never hear again. She chattered constantly, a mix of English and the Chinese words Leanne and Mai were teaching her, her world expanding with every new syllable. It was the smell of baking bread mingling with the scent of wild sage that Mai planted in a small garden by the kitchen door. The house, once a hollow shell, was now filled with the aromas of life, of sustenance, of care. Arthur found himself working with a renewed purpose. He repaired the fences, cleared the fields, and bought 2 new mares, his movements no longer driven by the numb pull of obligation but by the desire to build something lasting, something worthy of the 4 people who now called this place home. He learned the language of silence they had all once shared was not one of emptiness, but of profound communication. He learned to understand the slight frown on Leanne's face that meant the well water was low, the small smile Mai gave when the bread rose perfectly, the way Lily's hand would seek his when she was tired. He, in turn, communicated through his actions. He built 2 proper beds for the girls' room, the scent of fresh sawn pine a testament to his gratitude. He bought them bolts of soft blue calico in town, a silent apology for the rags they had arrived in. He began to smile again, small, rusty smiles at first, but they slowly grew more frequent and genuine, crinkling the corners of his sun-weathered eyes. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of rose and lavender, he found Leanne on the porch, watching the horizon. She was holding a small, intricately carved wooden flute he had never seen before. She put it to her lips, and a melody drifted into the evening air. It was a song of heartbreaking beauty, filled with a longing for a land she would never see again, but also with a quiet, resilient hope for the one she was in. It was the sound of her soul, and she was sharing it with him. He sat down on the steps beside her, not speaking, simply listening, sharing the moment of quiet beauty. The music was a story of its own, a tale of hardship and survival, and in its notes, he finally understood the depth of the strength she and her sister possessed. Their past remained a locked room, the key held solely by them. Arthur never asked about the land they'd come from or the horrors that had led them to a poker table in a dusty saloon. He knew trauma recognized its own reflection, and he gave them the same grace of silence they had once given him. But sometimes, in unguarded moments, glimpses of that past would surface. A flinch at a raised voice, a shadow that passed over Mai's eyes when a stranger rode too close to the house, the way they would sometimes speak to each other in rapid, hushed tones, their hands instinctively seeking each other's as if for an anchor in a sudden storm. Arthur learned to be their shield. When he went to town for supplies, they now came with him, sitting tall and dignified on the wagon seat. The first time, the townsfolk had stared, whispering behind their hands. Finch and his cronies were there, leaning against the general store, their faces curdled with resentment. Arthur simply stared back, his gaze flat and hard, until they looked away. He conducted his business, introducing the women not as his help, but simply as Lian and Mai, his tone leaving no room for questions. He was drawing a new map, not just for his family, but for the world around them, demanding they be seen as people, not as curiosities or property. Lily was their stanchest and most innocent defender. When a shopkeeper's son pointed and called the sisters a cruel name, Lily, all of 6 years old and barely reaching the boy's chest, planted her hands on her hips and said, "They are my family. And they are beautiful." The boy, stunned into silence by her fierce loyalty, had simply backed away. In that moment, Arthur felt a surge of pride so immense it almost brought him to his knees. He had not just rebuilt a home, they had all, together, forged a family, an unshakable unit bound not by blood, but by the deliberate, daily choice to love and protect one another. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary, its windows bright with lamplight, its rooms filled with the sounds of 3 languages and one shared heart. The poker game felt like a lifetime ago, a sordid dream from another man's life. He had sat down at that table a broken man, playing a game of chance. He had walked away with something far more valuable than he could ever have imagined, a lesson in grace, a reason to live, and the quiet, extraordinary love of a family he had not known he was searching for. He had been dealt a cruel hand, but Lian, Mai, and Lily had taught him how to play it with an open and grateful heart.